I've always been an avid outdoorsman. You wouldn't have to ask anyone close to me if I am or not. They'd all say the same thing. I practically live in the woods. I work as a maintenance park supervisor at one of the 20 metro parks in Ohio. I'm one of the few people that say they truly love their job. I spend the majority of each day in the woods, overseeing the staff and making sure that all the employees are following the checklists. I absolutely love nature, so getting paid to be around it is a win-win deal for me. When I'm not at work, I take every chance I get to go camping, hiking, or both. My 5-year-old daughter has obviously seen her fair share of nature given that I'm her parent, and she's developed a great love for it as well. Almost every Saturday, as long as the weather isn't bad, we take the day to go hiking. It's always been fun, peaceful, and a great way for us to bond. However, this past weekend's hiking trip was completely different. It started off just as any other Saturday. My daughter and I got up at 8 a.m. and bundled up in our hats, jackets, and gloves. The weather was calling for snow throughout the entire day, so we made sure to dress extra warm. Given that I generally knew every part of the park, we often made our makeshift hiking trails in vast wooded areas that even I was unfamiliar with. On this particular day, we hiked on one of our usual trails for a few miles, before we decided to explore an area that we'd never seen before. For situations like this, I've always kept blue ribbons in my backpack so that we could mark the trees every 20 yards so we wouldn't get lost. It was around 11 a.m. when we were already pretty deep into the woods. My daughter has incredible endurance, especially for her age, so our hike sometimes lasted 6 hours if we were feeling up to it. The snow was falling at a heavy rate, which made for a peaceful day as we talked and explored. The woods had a serene silence to them, which was only interrupted by our footsteps crunching in the snow. Sometime around this point, we decided to take a water break, so I cleared the snow off of a log and laid a blanket down so we could sit on it. We both sort of fell into a trance as we watched the snow cover everything around us. It was quite a sight to see. We were suddenly snapped out of that trance and brought back to reality when we heard a loud noise. It was so unexpected, and we both looked at each other in confusion as we tried to hone in on the strange sound. It was completely silent for a few seconds, until we heard it again, only this time much louder and clearer. At that moment, it felt like it got 20 degrees colder, but in the back of my mind, I knew what it was. It was a woman screaming at the top of her lungs. My daughter instantly clung onto me, visibly shaken from the ear-piercing noise. I was terrified, but I tried my best not to show it. Now, I know a lot of you will say that this was some sort of animal like a fox or a deer, but I can confidently recognize any noise an animal can make. I'm surrounded by them every day at work. This was not an animal. Although I tried to sound calm, my voice was shaky as I told my daughter it was just a fox. Thankfully, she wanted to turn back, and I agreed, since there was clearly something wrong. We started backtracking, and I began unwrapping my ribbons from the trees as we passed them. 5 minutes or so went by, and it was completely silent, so I started to relax a little bit. I struck up a conversation with my daughter to keep her mind off of it until we were interrupted by that terrifying scream again. Only this time, it was much closer. My heart started pounding as I realized that the sound was coming from the exact way we originally came. The sound echoing off the hills made it sound like it was coming from the east when we first heard it, but it was now apparent that it was coming from the north, in the exact direction we were walking. If this would have happened in literally any other part of the park, I'm confident that I would have been able to take an alternate route to our car. But since this was a massive unexplored area without any trails or maintenance work, I was completely unfamiliar. My only option was to continue backtracking to the ribbons, or we'd risk a great chance of getting lost. We continued walking, but my mind was flooding with terrible thoughts as I tried to make sense of why this woman was screaming. It sounded so close when we heard it at first, but after covering hundreds of feet, it still sounded like it was right in front of us. This person was screaming louder than anything I've ever heard in my entire life. More time passed, and we were still miles from the car. The screaming would occasionally start and stop, but the closer we got, the more frequent it became. It was getting more and more obvious to me that this was a horrendous scream. It was solely out of pain. That's when I decided to whip out my phone and call the police. Something was seriously wrong. Of course, being surrounded by large valleys and woods knocked out my service, so I had to wait. It wasn't very uncommon, since these metro parks had notorious drop zone spots where you'd have no chance of making a call until you reached higher ground. When I finally got service, I dialed the police. During the entire call, the screams were louder than ever and very easy to hear over the phone. We eventually noticed that the screams sounded to be coming from the right of us, which meant that we were thankfully passing them. Every part of me wanted to go towards the screaming to help whoever it was, but I knew I could be risking my daughter's life too, so I continued on. We eventually made it back to the car, where I met up with the police and marked the general area on a map for them. They ended up being very suspicious of me, but realized I had nothing to do with it after asking some questions. I've been checking the news every day since that Saturday, waiting for the dreaded news title to pop up on the screen, but there's been nothing. Who knows, maybe it was someone playing a sick prank. I'd like to think that, but something inside me knows what it really was. They were the desperate screams of a woman in tremendous pain. All I can do at this point is hope they're okay. My cousins and I have always been very close. They're twin brothers, named Ryan and Mitch. We grew up together in Pennsylvania, before my uncle got a new job, forcing them to relocate to Ohio. It was a big change for me, considering we grew up on the same street and saw each other just about every day for most of my life. We'd try to keep in touch, but life really got in the way of that as we got older. They both got full-time jobs while I was still in college, so we'd only see each other on the holidays if we were lucky. A couple months ago, Ryan and Mitch called me. We chatted for a while and caught up, pondering over our days as little kids who lived in the mountains of Pennsylvania. We soon got on the topic of cross-country skiing, which was something we used to regularly do back in the day. They mentioned how they missed our impromptu skiing days that we'd take on snow days, so we picked out a date and went with it. Since I didn't have a full-time job, I told them I'd come to Ohio. It would be just like the good old days, except it would be in a different state. The drive was only 4.5 hours away, so I planned on making a one-day trip. I left early on Saturday morning and made it there around 9:30 a.m. They mentioned how they found a pretty cool spot that was only 10 minutes away from their house, so we set off for the big day. We went down a long road that was pretty secluded from other houses and businesses in the area. It eventually led to a bridge that overlooked a ravine, hundreds of feet below. Just before the bridge, we parked, got out, geared up, and slowly made our way down the hill leading to the area below the bridge. Just having skis on felt so nostalgic and brought back all of my great childhood memories. I think my cousins felt the same way too, because we all felt the same euphoric feeling. It just snowed several inches the night before on top of the pre-existing snow, so the conditions were ideal for the day ahead. It was perfect. We explored vast amounts of land, and even found an abandoned train station by an old railroad. To our surprise, the door was unlocked, so we stepped inside and sat on the wooden bench that was drilled into the side of the wall by the main desk. Reminiscing thoughts of our childhood days continued to appear out of nowhere, and our conversation felt endless. At some point, Ryan stepped outside to smoke, while Mitch and I continued to chat. Just seconds after stepping out, Ryan came bursting in through the door with a panicked look on his face. All he said was, "Guys, someone's out there." I was pretty much in disbelief. I assumed that he was messing with us, until he looked out the window and said they were coming. Mitch and I got up to look, and sure enough, there was someone heading directly towards the building from the exact way we came from, maybe 100 feet away. I got worried, hoping that it wasn't a cop that somehow spotted us and was coming to write us a ticket for trespassing. It didn't make sense though, considering we were seemingly in the middle of nowhere. As the person approached, it was apparent that it was definitely not a cop. It was a man. He was wearing a red windbreaker with black shorts. He was very underdressed, given the single-digit temperatures. We stepped outside, expecting to see a local who was mad at us for going inside the building. As soon as the person noticed us, he stopped in his tracks. After no movement of any kind, Mitch yelled out, "Hey, you alright, man?" He didn't reply, but instead turned around and began walking the other way. It was strange, but we didn't really talk about it much after that. We went back inside and finished the food we packed with us, then decided it would be a good time to start heading back to the car. The guy was heading in the direction we came from towards our car, so Ryan and Mitch were persistent in getting back as fast as possible. By the time we packed up and got going, the man was long gone and completely out of sight. We followed our ski tracks from earlier in the snow, this time going much slower, since the land slightly inclined for most of the way. As soon as we got to where the man was originally standing, we found his footprints. We weren't exactly sure where he was now, but his footprints were heading right along our path we made from earlier. I started getting a little unsettled, as I started wondering if he'd been following us from a distance the whole day. Something just felt off. Why would he have followed us? And why was he heading directly along our path in the direction we came from? Another hour went by, and there was still no sight of the strange man from earlier. However, his footsteps were still visibly heading in the same direction we were. By now, I was starting to get really concerned, and I think Ryan and Mitch were too. He couldn't have been far. Finally, we spotted the bridge in the distance, so we picked up the pace in eager attempt to get to the car and leave. As I was looking ahead, I spotted something on the bridge that froze me in my tracks. The man was standing on top of the bridge, waving at us. We all looked at each other in disbelief. This person followed our path all the way out to the train station we found and was now waiting for us to get back. It definitely disturbed us a bit, but again, we were 3 grown men. The chances of us not being able to fight him off if it came to it were slim, so we didn't worry about it too much. We reached the point where we had to start ascending the land alongside the bridge that was maybe 50 feet away. We lost sight of the man as we ducked into the wooded area adjacent to the bridge. The climb at the end was the worst part, since the land was on a very steep incline. Once we made it to the top, I was the first to step out of the brush and look towards the bridge. He was gone, or at least I thought he was. As we started walking alongside the road, I spotted footsteps that emerged out of the woods ahead. The sun was starting to set, but the light provided just enough visibility to see his footsteps in the snow again. They led straight to the car. As soon as we got to the car, I noticed that the footsteps circled around the car several times, but the car was thankfully untouched. That's when I realized I could see the footprints on the side of the bridge from where he was standing before. I closely followed them, mostly out of curiosity and a little bit of concern. What I saw still unsettles me to this day. They led to the side of the bridge where we saw him standing, then they led to the other side. The only difference was that after the man walked to the other side of the bridge, the footsteps ended. Ryan and Mitch were shocked as I showed them, and we all got a sick feeling in our stomachs. We realized it had to be one of 2 things. Either the person somehow vanished in thin air after reaching that side, or they jumped off the bridge. I looked down towards the ravine, but it was too far away to make anything out. We were pretty shaken up by this, and tried to come to a reasonable conclusion as to what happened as we drove back home. Who knows? Maybe it was just a big misunderstanding, and the footprints went somewhere else. But unless all 3 of us are blind, I know for a fact that they didn't. Something inside me knows that the person jumped. As awful as it is to think about, it still leaves me with so many unanswered questions. Why did he follow us all that time? Did he need us to help him? Or was he planning on doing something terrible? Neither myself or my cousins will ever know what his intentions were that day. Ever since I retired as a school teacher, I've been in a perpetual state of boredom. Everyone always talked about the wonders of retirement, but I've seemed to have found the opposite. It's torture. Every day feels the exact same, and I hate not being productive. I was a high school science teacher for over 20 years. It's kept my mind young in my old age, but it's something I dearly miss. This past summer, I started searching for jobs in the area to give myself something to do. I stumbled across a bus driver position for an elementary school. I live in Cincinnati, Ohio, so there are several schools within a 15-mile radius of my house. I was a bit hesitant at first, since I didn't know if I had the energy to deal with the little kids, but after some contemplation, I took the job. It wasn't a great job by any means, since it had its negatives. I quickly learned within the first few weeks that some of the kids were extremely disobedient and rambunctious. However, my route was in a very good neighborhood, with many of the kids living in houses that I still couldn't afford even after working my entire life. The neighborhoods were very upper class to say the least. During the last week before winter break, I was doing my usual routine. I'd work in the morning, getting the kids to school, then go home for a few hours, before I'd have to go out again and drop them off in the afternoon. My afternoon shift on this day started off just like any other. There weren't as many kids taking the bus this day, so it looked like it was going to be a pretty quick shift. I was approaching the last neighborhood on the route for the day, which was pretty large. If I remember correctly, about 8 or 9 students lived in this development. Just like the entire area, the houses were very nice and it was a safe neighborhood, or at least I thought. As I pulled up to a stop at the end of a street to let 3 kids out, I noticed a man standing on the sidewalk looking at the bus as we approached. He had a maroon Volkswagen parked off to the side of the road. I assumed it was someone's parent, since many parents will wait outside for the kids to get dropped off. I have a pretty good memory, and I don't remember seeing this individual before. 2 second grader boys and 1 kindergartner girl got off, and I watched as they safely crossed the street, heading towards the man. It was cold and snowy out, so the windows were rolled up, but I noticed that the man seemed to be talking to the little girl. I couldn't make out the conversation, but from what I could tell, the girl looked uncomfortable as she inched away from him. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what was going on. That all quickly changed when the man raised his voice at the girl and she started running towards the bus. I opened the door and watched as she stepped inside the bus, crying and visibly shaken. I asked her if she knew who that man was, and she nodded her head yes. Confused, I stepped out of the bus and confronted the man, asking what the problem was. He spoke in a slurred tone, stumbling over his words. Even if the girl really knew him, his clear signs of intoxication were enough for me to know that the girl wasn't safe going in the car with him. I followed my gut and drove off, as the little girl continued to cry. I was pretty confused and a little worried at this point, but I decided to call my boss and ask once I dropped off the remaining kids. As soon as I looked in the rearview mirror, I noticed the car was closely following behind us. It was concerning, but I assumed he was just angry because I wouldn't let her go with him, since he was obviously drinking. Either way, I knew I wasn't in the wrong and wouldn't be punished for it. I kept on driving, as I noticed that the car continued to trail us. I wasn't comfortable with dropping off anyone else as long as the car was there, so I asked the little girl more about the man. She wouldn't say much. She only mentioned that it was her dad's friend. This put me in a difficult situation, since I still had several kids on the bus and was being followed by that car, which obviously prevented me from dropping off anyone else. I decided to call the school and have them contact the parents of the little girl to ask if they knew about her dad's friend. Well, shortly after I made that call, I got a call back from the school. They told me that the parents demanded to not let their daughter go with him. He should have no business being there. That was enough for me to involve the police. I spoke with the dispatcher, who told me to continue driving through the neighborhood until I saw a police cruiser. Within 5 minutes, I spotted 2 police cars turn down the streets and they flicked their lights on. They pulled the car over, arresting the man on the spot. I was able to safely finish my drop-offs after that, and I didn't hear anything until a couple days later. As I was picking up the students on the last day before Christmas break, the dad of the girl handed me a Christmas card that said thank you on it. I didn't open it until I got home, but once I did, I was shocked. He told me that the man who was attempting to pick up his daughter was a former employee of his and was just fired. They apparently got into a huge altercation at work. The man was familiar with the dad's family since he had him over, along with several other employees for dinner that previous summer. That story shook me to my core, as I realized that that man had some sort of revenge plotted. It sickened me trying to think about what he would have done to her. I'm just so grateful that I stuck around longer than usual when I noticed the man waiting for the bus, because if I'd left, it could have ended much worse.